Okay, so the topic for today's discussion is sustainability and healthy plant-based eating. The panelists for today's discussion are Michael Fox and Shen Ming Lee. I hope, Shen, I've pronounced your name correctly.
Fine, thank you.
Welcome. Just a brief introduction about Michael. Michael grew up as a meat-loving Australian. As a child, he once penned a song more like a demanding chant entitled Stick of Glory. He became vegetarian in 2015 for health, environmental, and ethical reasons, but he still craves the Stick of Glory. Michael shops at his local farms market on the Sunshine Coast in Australia on a Saturday morning, bakes sourdough, brews water kefir, and has gotten accidentally drunk when a batch went awry. That's cool. And generally likes to cook healthy food for his family, which includes a 3 and a 1 year old. Wow, that's also great. He wanted to combine his craving for meat with his healthy home cooking habits to create a whole food-based, plant-based meat. The result is Fable. So he would start with a small presentation about Fable. Um, we have Shen Ming Lee. She's from Malaysia. She's an author, advocate, and ecosystem builder passionate about agri-food tech and social impact. She's the author of Hungry for Disruption, How Tech Innovations Will Nourish 10 Billion by 2050, and previously founded two social food ventures. Through her work, Shen aims to help build thriving ecosystems that can support a more sustainable, connected, and innovative food system. She's worked to support the agri-food innovation ecosystem through her work at Thought for Food, Grow, and a Food Future Company. A lover of all things gastronomy and avocado, Shen grew up in Malaysia and previously lived in Singapore and New York. In her free time, she loves to cook and bake, go to farmers markets, box spin, and watch Chef's Table and Suits. Welcome, Michael and Shen, and over to you, Michael.
Cool. Thank you. I will just share my screen here and share all panelists. Here we go. Cool. So I'll just share some slides here. You guys can see that okay? Sorry, can you see those slides okay?
Yeah.
Yep.
Maybe
cool.
you can just make it like a full screen.
Yep. Cool. So Fable, we're all about making delicious meaty food from mushrooms. So to share a little bit of our background, as was touched on in the introduction, I've been vegetarian for coming up to 5 years for a mix of ethical, environmental, and health reasons, and I wanted to help people to reduce their meat consumption for all the same reasons that I'm vegetarian. I've been living in Los Angeles for the last for about 4 years and eating all the Impossible and Beyond burgers, and could see that there was a good path to, a lot of people want to reduce their meat consumption, but they still love the taste and texture of meat. So if you can give people a product that has the taste and texture of meat, but make it from something other than animals, people will be, people want to reduce their meat consumption. So we help make it easy by making delicious meaty food from mushrooms. My two co-founders, so Jim Fuller is a fine dining chef and mushroom scientist, and Chris McLaughlin co-founded Australia's largest organic mushroom farm. So between Chris and Jim, they know everything there is to know about growing mushrooms, the science behind them, and how to cook them. So they form the technical side of the business, and then my background is in entrepreneurship, and previously co-founded a fashion technology business which I ran and built for 10 years. I obviously come to the space as a passionate vegetarian. So together we co-founded Fable, and we launched Fable in December last year. So a little bit of data behind why meat alternatives. So consumers are getting much more conscious about what they're eating. 1 in 3 Australians and Americans want to reduce their meat consumption, and the stats are similar in a lot of different markets. The primary reason people give for wanting to eat less meat is to improve their health. There's also other issues around sustainability. 14.5% of the global greenhouse gas emissions are caused by animal agriculture. It's more than all of transport combined. And 38.5% of the world's habitable landmass is devoted to animal agriculture, mostly to grow all the crops, which are then fed to factory farmed animals. So there's those reasons as well, but the primary reason, the most common reason people give for wanting to reduce their meat consumption is health reasons. Basically the amount of meat that we eat, particularly in Western markets. In Australia, we eat on average 110 kilograms of meat per person per year, and that's just not good for us. But people love the taste and texture of meat. So while they want to reduce meat, there's a lot of people who still don't want to compromise on taste. In Australia, at least, we're about 12% of the population are either vegan or vegetarian. I know that's higher in countries like India and some other markets, but it hovers around that sort of 10-12% for most Western markets. But there's still around 30 to 40% of consumers who actively want to reduce their meat consumption but still eat meat. Feedback from consumers is that choices for meat alternatives can improve. So there's some good meat alternatives out on the market, but there's feedback that those could improve in terms of taste. There's feedback that some of them are too processed, and feedback around price. So those were kind of the key issues that we looked to solve in launching Fable. And as I mentioned, we make delicious meaty food from mushrooms. We aim to replicate the taste and texture of slow cooked meats. So there's quite a few products out on the market that replicate burgers and mince. We replicate sort of pulled pork, braised beef and beef brisket. Our product's 62% shiitake mushroom. And then we use a short list of all natural plant-based ingredients. So we don't use any artificial ingredients in our product at all. And we designed our product specifically to launch into food service and for chefs to use. So a little bit more on the taste and texture. We leverage the delicious umami flavors of shiitake mushrooms to create our meat. And as I mentioned, we replicate that sort of delicious kind of slow cooked meaty texture. On the health side, as I mentioned, products 62% shiitake mushroom. Shiitake mushrooms have been used in Chinese medicine for thousands of years to treat all sorts of health conditions. They're high in fiber, vitamin B12, iron, vitamin D. And as I mentioned, we use all natural ingredients, nothing artificial, no textured vegetable protein, no modified starches. We're a whole food based, all natural meat alternative. And we launched our product, we developed our product for chefs, and we were thrilled to launch our product in partnership with the 3 Michelin star British chef Heston Blumenthal in his restaurant in the UK, the Fat Duck. So Heston's using our product in all his UK restaurants, and we did our launch event at his Melbourne restaurant, Dinner by Heston. We launched in December last year, initially rolled out into food service, and I need to update this slide, but we're now served at over 100 venues around Australia, as well as Heston's UK restaurants, and we've recently launched into Singapore, and we've had really good feedback from customers in food service. Just some examples of the kind of dishes that venues are making with the product. Everything from burgers, and you can see another one in my background, Mexican food on pizzas, basically anywhere that you would use a pulled pork, a braised beef, or a beef brisket. We also launched into meal kits. MARLEY Spoon in Australia are the second largest meal kit company. We launched with them in December. Product's gone really well there. We've launched into retail. So Harris Farms, a premium retailer in Australia. We launched with them in April this year. And then Woolworths are the largest retailer in Australia, and we launched into 600 of their stores in June And then we've just launched 3 ready meals into Woolworths as well 3 weeks ago. And again, really positive and good feedback from consumers cooking with our product at home. We're working on some additional shiitake mushroom-based meat alternatives as well, so a minced beef and a burger patty. And basically our goal is to replicate all the different types of meat that we eat. So as people that we eat, so we've started with those slow cooked meats, but we want to produce mushroom-based versions of all of the main types of meat, with the goal of helping reduce meat consumption around the world. The animal meat industry is worth about $2 trillion a year, which is about 2.5% of global GDP. And it's a huge, one of the world's biggest industries. And it's our view that that industry will shift. I think in 20 years' time, more than half of the meat eaten by consumers will come from sources other than animals. And that shift will come as alternatives start to, people buy food based on taste and price. So if we can make meat alternatives that taste better than animal meat and offer them at a price lower than animal meat, then we think that there'll be no reason for people to eat meat from animals anymore, and meat alternatives will take over animal meat in the market. So that's a quick background on Fable, and happy to have a chat, Shen. Looking forward to it.
Thanks, Michael, for giving us an overview of Fable. Really exciting things there. I think you've covered some of this already in terms of how people's motivations for, going more towards being flexitarians and not eating in so much of meat. So, but I'm curious if you have any other kind of perspectives or insights when it comes to how consumers are seeing meat consumption and some trends that you're seeing in terms of people's approaches to going more meat-free in Australia and the UK, where, Fable is operating.
Yeah, so there's definitely more people turning off meat completely. So the vegan vegetarian segment in Australia grew by about 2% of the Australian population turned vegan or vegetarian in the last 12 months. So pretty rapid growth there. And then there's this big kind of burgeoning sort of flexitarian segment. It's kind of called in the space. So those are people who still eat meat, but are actively wanting to reduce their meat consumption. And that's about 32% of the Australian population sort of identify as flexitarian or wanting to reduce their meat consumption. And those stats are similar in most Western markets, and actually even in a lot of Asian markets as well. There's kind of similar trends towards people either cutting out meat completely or wanting to reduce their meat consumption. So our goal is to help make that easier.
Yeah, absolutely. And obviously a lot of alternative protein and these meat alternatives is a huge topic and hot topic in food right now. And will continue to be a huge topic in the coming years as we try to also, as consumers are recognizing just how carbon emissions heavy, like our industrial animal agricultural system is, and just the health implications as well of consuming too much meat, right? And so, I'm curious from your perspective, what do you think are some of the shortcomings of the industry right now that you're seeing and that, you aim to address with Fable as well?
Yeah, so I think if you rewind 5 years ago, the meat alternatives that were on the market really didn't taste great, and they were pitched really at kind of the hardcore vegan or vegetarian who definitely doesn't eat meat and will kind of suffer for just to not eat meat. They're willing to eat something that doesn't quite, definitely doesn't taste like meat, but they're very motivated to do that because they're fully vegan or vegetarian. Over the last 5 years, that's changed and better products have been coming out into the market, but there's still a lot of improvement that can be made in terms of taste and texture. I think most products on the market, certainly if you ate most products in the market on their own, you could tell it's not meat. Often cooked in a dish, that's the products are getting to the point now where you can't tell the difference between them and meat. But that's improving rapidly, and our goal is to help continue improving that shift, so making all the plant-based meat alternatives taste more like meat. Second big factor for people buying meat or any food is price. And at the moment, meat alternatives on average are more expensive than their animal meat counterparts. And, you know, that's just a function of scale. So animal meat is actually really expensive to produce. So take a cow, you need to feed a cow 12 kilograms of plants to get 1 kilogram of beef. So it's a pretty expensive way to produce food. When we make our Fable slow braised beef, for example, it's, you know, pretty much a 1-to-1 conversion ratio from our mushroom and plant-based ingredients. 1 kilogram of inputs, we get 1 kilogram of meat at the end. So in theory, with scale, we're going to be able to price, our cost base is going to be so much lower than animal meat. We're going to be able to price lower than animal meat. But our industry, our space just needs scale. So at the moment, meat alternatives make up less than 1% of the total meat market. Animal meat makes up more than 99% of it. So animal meat's got the scale, but that's rapidly changing. And I think fast forward 5 or 10 years. I mean, in our segment, so braised beef and beef brisket is actually quite an expensive meat to begin with. So we price our product in Woolworths at the same price as our animal meat equivalent. So we're kind of one of the first examples of where we're actually at price parity with animal meat for our product. And that's gonna start to happen more and more in the category with other meat alternatives as well. And then the primary reason that people want to reduce their meat consumption is health, as I mentioned. And so one of the pieces of pushback that meat alternatives sometimes get is that, to mimic meat, they sometimes use sort of artificial binders and they use textured vegetable protein, which is, it's not that it's an unhealthy product, but it's just a little bit processed. And so some consumers push back on those things. And so, yeah, I think meat alternatives over time, and this is core to our value proposition, is making meat alternatives, using all natural ingredients, keeping the processing to a minimum, keeping that sort of whole food base in the products. And I think more meat alternatives, will move in that direction over time. And that's certainly a segment of the market that we play in. So yeah, I think still a lot of room for meat alternatives to improve, but if you go rewind 5 years and compare where the space was then to where the space is now, it's been a huge shift. And fast forward 5 years from now, that rate of change is only accelerating. So I think all these problems are going to get solved pretty quickly.
Yeah, absolutely. You touched on really good points on scale and, achieving price parity with conventional meat products, as well as just how processed some of these products are in terms of how we're judging it and consuming it, if health is, the major motivation for us to switch over. And just now when you're talking about, vegetarian products just 5 years ago, it makes me think of, in Asia at least, a lot of these mock meat or tofu derivative products that, we're pretty used to, and that's actually steeped in a lot of Buddhist cultures and, eating vegetarian for cultural reasons. So I think some things that, just to add a little bit, like I think protein source diversification is also a huge kind of shortcoming that I think needs to be addressed. And I think that's definitely something that, what the work that you're doing at Fable is trying to address in terms of the reliance on a lot of commodity crop-based protein inputs, like soy protein isolate, pea protein isolate. And, the reason I think it could become an issue if we become overly reliant on them is we're at risk of kind of repeating the same issues of monocropping of the past, few years, and just dedicating more and more land to producing the same few crops, right? And with limited diversification. And so then we don't really have a resilient food system. And obviously COVID has shown us how important diversification is. And I think like there's also a limited range of products in terms of what categories these alternatives are in meat. So, the majority are focused on minces and not as much on whole cuts of meat. So that's obviously something that you're trying to address. And I think that's huge, considering that, I think more than 80% of the value of the meat market is in that segment rather than the mint segment. So I think there's a lot of shortcomings still and more work to be done, but we've definitely come really far. So tell me a little bit more about the magical world of mushrooms and mushroom-based meat, and do you see, the potential for this space to really address some of the shortcomings we just talked about?
So I think protein diversification is a really good point. And I think for to have a more regenerative agricultural system that is going to be more readily achieved if we're not growing the same, acres and thousands, millions of acres of the same couple of crops like we do today with soybeans, pea, corn, some other sort of really significant crops. It'd be great if and wheat, it'd be great if we could diversify that. And I think mushrooms are a great way to do that. Another really interesting thing about mushrooms is they're a different a different kingdom. So they're not a plant. They don't use photosynthesis, so they can be grown in conditions where there aren't light. Different species of mushrooms are different, but they often grow on agricultural waste products. So they're great for processing waste in the agricultural system. So they're an awesome crop to add into a regenerative agricultural cycle. So shiitake mushrooms, for example, grow on wood, and our shiitake mushrooms grow on waste out of sort of wood production. So you've got sort of farms growing wood to produce timber, and then they take the sawdust and form those into logs and grow our shiitake mushrooms on that sort of waste wood products. That breaks down the sawdust, turns it into soil, which can then be used as sort of fertilizer to then grow other crops. So it's a really sustainable way of producing food. I think all sorts of different species of mushrooms can be used in different ways in the agricultural system like that. So we use shiitake mushrooms today, but there'll be other types of mushrooms that we can use in the future. And it'd be great to see more people eating mushrooms in all sorts of different forms, whether those are fresh or in meat alternatives like ours. Actually, a question for you, Shen. I'd be interested. I've read your book about the future of food, and I know you've spent time with the Good Food Institute and spent a lot of time looking into and thinking about cellular agriculture, which is obviously another interesting path for replicating meat from animals. So taking a biopsy from an animal and then reproducing those cells to grow meat. I'd be interested in your take on the growth of the cellular agricultural space versus the plant-based space, and how you see those two areas sort of competing or playing out,
it's very exciting space, and obviously cultured and cell-based is a segment of alternative protein, one of the segments, and it's definitely in its infancy, very nascent space, obviously not reaching commercialization yet. There's only about 40 plus companies in the space, and we are seeing the industry kind of fragment in terms of some companies just focus on the media, let's say, of actually producing the cells, producing the protein, and then you have companies focused on like bioreactor design and scaling up. And so the biggest barriers still are, in the cost of the media, which is kind of the nutrient solution to grow the cells, and then the design of the bioreactors, which don't currently exist for kind of this type of protein production. And so how do you build a scalable production system? And, that involves a lot of bioprocessing kind of engineering capabilities that we're still, kind of developing and tapping. And so the short answer is we're probably not going to see commercialization until probably 8 to 10 years, hopefully. That's kind of, the most kind of realistic goal, I think. Some companies are already planning to roll it out in, 2 to 5 years, but it's really hard to say, considering we're not really reaching prices that are very price competitive to industrial meat, even though it's the exact same thing. And realistically, it should cost the same, if not less, because you're taking the animal and the entire production system out of the equation. But in terms of how that's fitting into this whole trend of plant-based meat, I think in the long run, plant-based meat is the only vegetarian option, right? And so vegans and vegetarians are going to go, a lot of them go meatless for ethical and environmental reasons. I would say the majority. And so they surprisingly would see clean meat, I think, as a serious alternative and gravitate towards it. We even have, very staunch vegan groups like PETA kind of endorsing cultured meat, which is a great sign as it becomes commercial. But I think the majority of consumers do still cut out meat for these reasons, and so plant-based meat could to me be just a substitute placeholder waiting for, I think, cultured meat to arrive on the shores of our shelves. And so, yeah, I say this because I think a lot of common production techniques that we're seeing in plant-based, like extrusion, is becoming really commoditized by a lot of companies. And so these products we're seeing now, I think, will also become really saturated in the future, which is then when I think cell-based could win in long term. But yeah, I think working with GFI, I think they also see it this way, but several years down the line, this is another scenario where the lines between these two categories, cell-based and plant-based, will increasingly blur as well. Could be another scenario that we're seeing, just because of, to form kind of blended products that could bring another kind of generation and level of products that we haven't seen yet. And I say this because I know of cultured meat companies like Aleph Farms that are, looking at plant-based fat sources or plant-based scaffolding, the structures that you grow the cells on in the production of their products, because they want to create kind of non-saturated fat meat products. So yeah, I think there's two scenarios where it's just plant-based is just a placeholder, and then cell-based meat comes in and removes a lot of the barriers to eating meat that we see today. Or we could go into a generation where we're seeing a lot of blended products, and we are kind of seeing blended products in the market nowadays. If you look at what Tyson has rolled out, and some other of the big meat players. So yeah, a few scenarios, but it's exciting to think what could happen.
That's good. Is there a sense in the cell-based space of what the cost can get down to? Because one of the things that, in my view, people buy food. And I think a lot of research, not just my view, but a lot of research says people buy food based on taste, texture, and price. Those are kind of the big things. I think looking at plant-based meat alternatives, they can get down orders of magnitude below the cost of animal meat. Like, that's very clear. Our product, even though we're not at significant scale yet, we're at the price of the animal meats that we're replicating. Fast forward another 5 years of scale under our belt, will be significantly cheaper than meat from animals. And so that's going to mean that the bar for, like you say, cell-based meat's probably 8 to 10 years away from commercialization. The price bar for meat is going to get lower and lower. It's not just going to stay where, maybe cell-based meat can get cheaper than animal meat, but if plant-based meat is already half the cost of animal meat, then the bar's been lowered further. Is there a sense for where cell-based meat can get to with scale in terms of price? Can it be cheaper than plant-based meat?
I think initially it's definitely going to be a very premium product that will be, higher in price than conventional meat or even seafood products that we're seeing, right? And you see that with companies like, for instance, Just Foods. They're working with the company that creates plant-based egg product. They're working with a producer in Japan on creating this Wagyu beef meat from cells. And so the reason they're doing that, and there's companies also creating foie gras, like a lot more of these premium products, because they're planning to enter the market at a premium cost at targeting meat products that are at a premium usually in terms of how it's served to consumers. So I think initially it will be like that. I think it won't, I think at least it won't be lower than plant-based. So considering how far kind of plant-based has come in terms of scalability, and even beyond meats and impossibles of the market have already almost reached price parity with burger products, or even lower now. So considering the advantage that plant-based has had to actually scale their production processes, and as well as input prices in terms of sourcing things like pea protein from companies like Purist, they've had a lot more time to do that, to do that cost cutting. And so I think it will take a long time before we even reach that, if we do reach cell-based being lower than plant-based. But I think in terms of where it will be in comparison to conventional meat, I think that is a bigger possibility as the plant-based price goes lower than conventional over time. But it's all dependent on a lot of things I mentioned, like the cell media, and which is kind of tailored to the biotechnology industry now in terms of its production, small scale versus large scale food grade that we need to reach, right? And that takes a lot of time, R&D. It takes a lot of capital as well. So it's all a matter of, I think, time, and the industry also, again, kind of setting up in terms of differentiation of different functions, because it's a hard feat to try to grow. I mean, meat is not just, muscle tissue. It's like fat tissue, lipids, it's connective tissue. How do you then piece that all together into creating a structured form of, meat? So there's so many factors to, and barriers still, I think, where it's really high in kind of plant-based in terms of achieving price parity. But hopefully in, 8 to 10 years, we'll get there, because I think it's possible.
Yeah, fascinating. Yeah.
It's very, very interesting space, though. I'm really excited about the space, and and this actually leads on to the question I had for you. And this might be, I mean, considering we're both pretty kind of, I would consider us food purists, where we, like to cook, we believe in natural whole foods, and we go to the farmer's market. Like, when you hear about things like cell cultured meat and, all these plant-based meat analogs, do you think that it could make our food, really like soulless, and the role of technology will make food not as pure and natural as it has in the past?
It's a super interesting question. And I mean, you think about going and shopping at the farmers markets, it's all part of the experience, is like talking to the farmer who's grown the produce, and getting, like, there's a guy who grows avocados at my local farmers market, and you can get stuck talking to him for half an hour about what's going on his avocado farm. And that's fun a lot of the time. I love that. And there's people there who are brewing kombucha and different things, and do a bit of that at home myself. So getting tips from them, like it's a whole kind of experience. And like you say, sort of a huge, I mean, the culture around food in different countries is all sort of super interesting and fascinating. And I mean, I think it is, it's really interesting to see how that's going to play out as the food industry changes so dramatically. I mean, I think there's still, like, we try to, with what we're doing, that retain that in the product. So, the product is 62% shiitake mushrooms. We don't process the mushrooms very heavily at all. So we try to keep that sort of natural, healthy, whole food base. And over time, we'll sort of share stories of the farms that the shiitake mushrooms are grown on, and still try to keep that those sort of almost farmers market elements to the brand and what we're doing, and tell lots of stories about mushrooms and the different things that can happen in that space. So I think that's important. I think that's kind of a key. Food is so integral to our culture that I think it would be great if we can retain that. And there is a risk that some of that gets lost as sort of plant-based and cell-based meat becomes sort of more industrialized.
Yeah, and the reason I asked that, and I've been asked this question too, which is that there's often two camps in the space, and it's very polarizing between people who believe in, technology and science. There's the prophets and the wizards, the wizards who believe in science and technology, and the prophets who believe we need to retain, the resources on our earth. We have limited resources. Let's not play with nature. Let's try to regenerate our earth. And so I always see those two camps, and I don't like how polarizing it is, because I don't think polarization is productive. And so I think the way that you're approaching it in terms of blending those two perspectives is really important, especially as these are two kind of sometimes clashing ideas, right? Like embracing natural whole foods that are clean label versus using technology to create better food that has been re-engineered to be better for us. So it's a tough balance. But even though I did write a book about the role of technology in the future of food, I still believe in, I come from like a hospitality background. I love to cook. Like, I believe in that kind of whole food movement still, and this bond between man and nature, that is cultivated through food, which is the reason why I also love talking to, farmers about what they produce. But at the same time, I think the impetus for writing the book was really like, I know how fast we're depleting our land of resources, how much agriculture is contributing to climate change. We just can't continue, producing food like we have for the past few centuries. And so we need to look at new and innovative ways of producing our food in the future, and, changing what we eat. So I think it's a hard balance, but I think we can all be in the middle and, come to a consensus. So
what given you've looked at so many different aspects of the future of food and technology, like, if if we fast forward 20 years from today, what do you think will be the things that are the most different in our food system compared with where we sit today?
Yeah, I think food will move from being just sustenance for us and actually being, food as medicine will be a huge change in how we eat. And I think we're already seeing that trend is already playing out in a huge range of functional foods. For instance, probiotic foods that have gut healing properties, or things like turmeric, which, have anti-inflammatory properties, adaptogenic mushrooms, reishi, cordyceps that are immunity boosting. And yeah, these are a lot of trends. I mean, this idea of food as medicine is already really prevalent in Asia, but I think it will extend to the rest of the world. And so that's how I think, we might be changing how we eat in the coming years. Going back to the whole protein discussion, I think definitely a huge percentage of our protein intake will be shifting from being derived from animals to being derived from plants, from fungi, from algae, from other organisms. And I'm hoping at least the food we eat will be will leave less of a carbon footprint with lower food miles. So, looking into the whole area of indoor farm technology and just the rise of urban agriculture and urban food manufacturing hubs, how these are going to play a role in actually making our food systems more localized and decentralized, and just, producing food near where we consume it, which is a pretty simple concept, but obviously not easy considering the rural and suburban divide. But yeah, I think the food we eat will hopefully be more nutritionally optimal as well, with the advent, like I talk a lot in the book about the role of gene editing as well as biofortification. I know it's a very controversial topic, but that's something that, the book is demystifying in terms of gene editing tools like CRISPR. And finally, I think food will be very personalized to our DNA. I think personalized nutrition is going to be an important shift in how we eat as we really learn more about our microbiomes and, how our DNA actually impacts what we should be and not eating in terms of, foods that are inflammatory for our body. Yeah, so I think those are some things I hope to see our food system going towards, do see it going towards.
Yeah, that's fascinating. What are some of the most interesting startups you've seen in that sort of personalized nutrition space, or is there much happening yet in that space?
I've seen some DNA, like 23andMe type of companies for food. So they actually take a blood sample and then they tell you exactly what you should be eating in terms of foods. And I've actually personally taken one of those called IgG, and that's the reason why I really believe in this, because I took that test. I went on the whole diet where I restricted a lot of foods that were really inflammatory for my body, and it's just made a whole difference to my body and my life. And so that's one of the reasons why I think it's a big it's going to be a big trend in the future. I don't think there's a lot yet that have successfully communicated why it's important to the market, but yeah, I think biofortification, again, tying in that idea of how we're creating food that is nutritionally optimal for us instead of just feeding us, how are we nourishing ourselves? That plays into educating us about what is nutritionally personal to us and what we should be consuming. And people talk about blood type diet, etc. There's a lot of old, thinking when it comes to personalized nutrition, but it's about how are we using the tools that we then have, things like DNA kits and, taking these sorts of blood tests to then inform how we eat in the future. But yeah, I haven't seen a lot of startups that are in this space that are doing it successfully yet, but it's more like a mindset, I think.
Yeah, fascinating. No, that's very cool.
So going back to alternative protein, where do you, I'll turn it back to you in terms of the future and say, where do you see the space, I hope to see the space 5 to 10 years from now?
Yeah. Well, I think it's interesting looking at taking the analogy of electricity production. So the cost today, there's very few coal plants being built around the world today because the cost of producing electricity from solar and wind is now cheaper than it is producing from coal. And so we're going to see a pretty rapid shift, I think over the next 20 years as more coal plants sort of hit their retirement age and get decommissioned, that electricity production is going to be replaced by solar and wind. And fast forward 20 years, yeah, most of the world's electricity production will come from renewable resources. And that's not necessarily even being driven by people wanting to do good for the world. It's just, it's capitalism, it's cheaper. So people will source the electricity that's cheaper. And I think that analogy is going to play out in the meat industry as well. Yeah, as we kind of touched on before, the costs of producing meat from animals is really expensive. And so as plant-based meat, cell-based meat, and become cheaper than animal meat and taste as good, or if not better, you can't really make improvements to a cow or a pig or a chicken from here unless you're going to genetically engineer them. We can keep developing and making our meat taste better. So we're going to get to a point, I mean, it's approaching already, where meat alternatives taste better than meat from animals, and they're cheaper than meat from animals. And so, yeah, looking at a 10 to 20 year time horizon, I think somewhere in that 10 to 20 year window, I think meat alternatives will take over animal meat in terms of being more of the meat market. And yeah, that's a $2 trillion industry. It's 2.5% of global GDP. So yeah, I think sort of 1.5% of global GDP is going to shift from animal meat to plant or cell-based meat, sort of within that kind of 10 to 20 year window. And yeah, it's not going to be vegans and vegetarians driving that for ethical, environmental reasons. It's going to be just people's preferences on taste and price that drive the bulk of that.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so it's our job as a meat alternative company to hone in on and make sure that our products end up tasting better, and that they're available at a price that's cheaper. And yeah, for those of us who do want to see that shift happen for ethical, environmental, and health reasons, the way to do it is to leverage capitalism to make it happen.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think I absolutely agree with what you've just said, and also going back to the shortcomings we talked about just now. Hopefully we have more corporations that will actually build out value chains that prioritize diverse crop inputs. Not just the same few ones that we're seeing. Things like other sources like lentils, chickpeas, lupini, beans. The reason why these aren't really prevalent, I think, is because the value chains aren't built out. So hopefully, we have more companies pumping capital into building out breeding programs for these sorts of crops. Policy actually reducing subsidies on commodity crops, and actually incentivizing corporations to use these diverse crops. And then we need consumers to then demand it, right? Yeah. So yeah, and I think there's just so much more to explore in terms of the plant-based and fungi-based, algae-based, so many different realms of alternative protein, and that opens a whole host of opportunities to mimic everything in our food right now. I hope to see more cleaner products like yours as well, that are more minimally processed, and more like culturally relevant products too. Like we always talk about in GFI APEC, we always say it's not just about the burger. We need to create culturally and ethnically relevant products for people in Asia. And Asia is not just one market either. Like if you go into all the countries in Asia, every single market is totally different. And there are companies like Green Monday Group, Omni Pork, Omni Meat that is doing that right now. And we need regulation and the government to also kind of embrace this movement.
Yeah. No, I totally agree. Yeah.
So exciting things for the future.
Definitely.
That's all I have now. But if we want to see if there's any questions, Smita.
There is no question, but yeah, that was quite a lot of information that you guys shared. Meat is something I mean, I'm a vegetarian, but I'm definitely looking at going vegan. I don't know how long will that take. But so how has been your journey, Michael, from going from meat to where you are now?
Yeah. So I definitely I grew up in Queensland in Australia, and this is kind of one of the beef capitals of the world. I had all my cousins run a beef farm, so always kind of on holidays would go visit the beef farm, and it's just ingrained in the culture here to eat a lot of beef, and so that's how I grew up, not sort of questioning it or thinking about it. And then it was probably about 15 years ago, I started to just sort of read a little bit about and just get a sense of particularly kind of the ethical issues around meat production. And I wasn't looking into it heavily, but I probably read a few kind of articles and different things that just sort of got me thinking, like, particularly for me, like some of the ethical things around, I grew up with a pet dog, and, pigs are just as intelligent as dogs. We would take our dog to the vet, and, we cried when our dog got old and died. Yet, like, pigs are treated horribly in factory farms, and, I'll go by and I used to go and buy a piece of pork at the supermarket and eat it. And so it's just some little ideas like that kind of caught in my head, that this just kind of seems a little bit strange, but I didn't spend a lot of time thinking about it. And so it was probably over a period of about 10 years, I was kind of reducing my meat consumption, because I sort of had a few of these thoughts. Actually, another ethical one is like, all fish that we eat die by asphyxiation. Like, they die by the equivalent of drowning. Like, they get taken out of the water and they drown. And, if I got a puppy on this video call and drowned the puppy, like, everyone would freak out, justifiably. Someone would hopefully call the police and I'd get taken off to jail. Yet every fish that we eat dies by drowning the same way. It just doesn't, like, it's just completely illogical. But it's because we have an emotional connection to dogs as pets. We have an emotional connection to puppies. We don't have an emotional connection with pigs, and even less with fish, because we kind of can't communicate with them. But it's an emotional thing, not a logical thing. So as some of those kind of ethical questions, prompted me to sort of reduce my meat consumption. So I guess I was in that flexitarian bucket for about 10 years, and I'd probably, over that 10-year period, reduced my meat consumption by sort of 2/3 or even 3/4. And then there was a book I read about 5 years ago called Eating Animals by an author, Jonathan Safran Foer. And it's the best laid out case for anything I've ever read. Like, I read that book and turned vegetarian as soon as I finished reading the last page. He outlines some of those thought experiments around the ethics. It's particularly focused on the ethics, but also talks through some of the sustainability issues. And then I went and read more books about sort of health. And there's pretty incredibly strong academic literature that the healthiest diets for humans to eat either have no meat or animal products in them, or very little in the way of meat or animal products in them. Certainly in Western countries, where we eat 110 kilograms of meat per person per year, we didn't evolve as humans eating that much meat. In Australia, bowel cancer is the 3rd largest cancer or killer of people in terms of cancer. And you literally don't get bowel cancer if you are vegan. It's highly correlated with not eating enough fiber. And if you eat 110 kilograms of meat each year, you won't be getting enough calories from plant-based foods. You won't be getting enough fiber, and your risk of bowel cancer is much higher. So I was reading more about all the health issues around not eating enough meat, and that was covered in those books. And so just switched to being vegetarian, and then just got more and more passionate about the space. Then I was doing more reading about the sustainability issues. The fact that 38.5% of the world's habitable landmass is devoted to animal agriculture. Like, that's insane, 38.5%. And that's particularly to grow all of the crops to feed factory farmed animals. Most of the meat that's eaten around the world now comes from animals living in factory farms. Those animals in factory farms need to be fed crops that are grown on farms. More than half the world's crops that are grown aren't fed directly to humans. They're fed to animals in factory farms. So if we switch to and it's because, like, a cow needs to eat 12 kilograms of plants to produce a kilogram of beef. For a pig, it's an 8-to-1 ratio. So if we switched to eating the plants directly, you could reforest like a quarter of the world's habitable landmass. And if you reforested that much of the world's landmass, you could capture a huge amount of the carbon that we've pumped into the atmosphere, and we could actually reverse global warming. So it's, yeah, to me, I just got more and more passionate about all of those sort of concepts, and wanted to help contribute to fixing that problem, and figured that the best way that I could do that would be to, yeah, help people reduce their meat consumption by producing delicious meat alternatives. And so I kind of from, you know, probably in the top couple of percent in the world in terms of the amount of meat that I ate, down to eating no meat at all and trying to get everyone else to switch away from eating meat. So that's probably about as big a shift as you can make. Yeah, but it was just as I learnt more that became a really clear thing that I wanted to do.
Awesome. The journey from meat to mushroom.
Yeah, it's been a fun journey.
Yeah.
Fun
Shen, do you?
journey. Sorry, what were you?
I was just asking if you would like to share something. There are no questions as such.
No, I think I have an interesting take to meat consumption, where I grew up in also a very meat loving Asian family, where a lot of our traditional dishes are relying on meat. So I didn't grow up, you know, vegetarian, but when I went to the US, I became vegetarian because of a lot of things situation for me in terms of cultural foods. Like if my grandma cooks something and I don't eat it, it's a huge slap in her face. So that's something that's an internal struggle for me when I come back, in terms of aligning my values of what I eat.